You know, out of all the new games that could release in 2024, I never expected the first actual masterpiece I'd play to come from Ubisoft of all companies, and yet here we are with the Prince of Persia, The Lost Crown. In hindsight though, this shouldn't have been too surprising, since the dev team behind this one is Ubisoft Montpellier, who are famous for the always beloved Rayman series as well as Valiant Hearts The Great War and Beyond Good and Evil. Frankly, I think most people would agree with me when I say that out of every part of this company, Ubisoft Montpellier easily has the best track record. To be honest though, I actually wasn't initially interested in The Lost Crown until I saw the gameplay for it, because up to this point I've never actually played a game in this series before, and I didn't know anything about it. All I knew when I saw the game in action was that it was a great-looking metroidvania, and longtime viewers will know I'm always down for games like this, and having now played it, I'm glad I gave the game a chance. Prince of Persia The Lost Crown has some of the most unique ideas I've seen in a metroidvania before, with the combat as well as platforming and puzzles also being some of the best in the subgenre. I'm getting way ahead of myself though. Before we get to any of that, we have a story to go over. After 30 years of drought and famine, the Persian Empire is in a pretty bad spot, especially after a recent attack from the Eastern Kushan Empire, which is fended off by the Immortals, a group of Persia's 7 most elite warriors, which happens to include our protagonist, Sargon. Sometime after Sargon brings down the Kushan general, the Persian prince Hassan is kidnapped during the victory party by a Persian general named Anahita, who was also Sargon's personal mentor. So the Immortals follow Anahita to Mount Kaf, a sacred mountain that houses a great city called the Citadel that, for unknown reasons in the past, started being affected by a strange curse that warps and messes with time in a whole host of complicated ways. Speaking as somebody who's new to this series, I didn't really know what to expect from the Lost Crown story going into it, and honestly this might be one of my favorite actual stories to come from a Metroidvania. The plot seems fairly straightforward on the surface, but there's plenty of really great twists that caught me way off guard that combined with Mount Kaf's time curse shenanigans had me constantly engaged with the story, and I loved the writing, especially during the game's second half where a lot of its best scenes are at. Really, the only weak part of the story would have to be with the Immortals themselves. With a couple exceptions, they don't get much focus in the story at all after the first hour, so the majority of them don't feel quite as important as they probably should. That being said though, I still did at the very least like nearly all of them to some extent despite that. And heck, some of them are actually really great, like the group's leader Varum and Sargon, who for spoiler reasons I can't really dive into. Honestly though, the only Immortal I don't feel at least kind of positive about is Rajan, who the story really just forgets about almost completely after a while. I don't dislike her at all, really I'm more indifferent to her than anything. It's just kinda baffling to me that she gets basically ignored and the story doesn't really do much of anything at all with her. On a much more positive note though, I think it's finally time we started getting into why Prince of Persia The Lost Crown is a masterpiece. The game's main setting, the Citadel, on the whole was pretty great. Each area was visually distinct from the other, and just like the rest of the game was very nice to look at, like the entirety of the upper city as well as the Tower of Silence, almost purely for this gorgeous view. Out of all of them though, my favorite area in the game visually easily has to go to the Raging Sea for being such a cool concept. Just before the curse started, a fleet of ships were being completely annihilated by a raging storm, only for the curse to come in and completely freeze this catastrophic moment in time. I cannot express to you enough just how cool I think the Raging Sea is. Honestly, from a purely visual perspective, this is easily one of my favorite areas in a Metroidvania ever. On a similar note, I also really liked how the other half of it has you needing to start up time again for that part of the area to move on. After all of the first half, this section made for a pretty great and fun payoff. Beyond the areas themselves though, I gotta say The Lost Crown is a surprisingly beefy game. Like, it's not Hollow Knight levels of big, but there's a surprising amount of stuff to do and find in this game compared to most other Metroidvanias I've played. Like, to put this into perspective, I can finish most Metroidvanias in, at worst, usually around 9 or 10 hours, whereas I beat this game at 17.5 hours, having only gotten around 75% of everything. This is a fairly beefy game. A large part of the reason why though is because of how many optional collectibles and upgrades as well as treasure chests there are, with some areas having more than 20 of them. Starting with the basics, we have your standard health upgrades, with the 24 Soma tree petals scattered throughout the world. These work pretty similarly to the heart pieces from Zelda in that you need to find 4 to get a health increase. There is an equivalent to heart containers in the game with Soma flowers, but there's only 6 in the game and the majority of them are dropped by required bosses, so you won't really need to think about these too much. Then we have the amulets and amulet holders. These work similarly to the charms and charm notches from Hollow Knight, with them serving as buffs and passive bonuses that all cost a certain amount of slots to equip, with the amulet holders increasing those. There's a grand total of 38 in the game that you can find or buy at shops, and while I personally stuck to some of the more basic amulets like the ones that increase health and your melee damage because I'm just a simple guy like that, there's tons of room to experiment if you want to try a loadout that's definitely more interesting than what I went with. You can also buy other upgrades by collecting Damascus ingots and Xerxes. These, along with the game's main currency time crystals, can be spent at the Haven's shop for upgrading how many potions you have and how much they heal. Similarly, you can also spend these at the goddess Keheva's forge in the Haven for making your sword and bow stronger, as well as your amulets. It's all pretty simple stuff, not really much more to say here. There's also tons and tons of smaller collectibles that exist purely for lore, and honestly, I love that the devs did this. It adds more stuff to find, which I of course always appreciate, but much more importantly, they do a good job at expanding on the world and history of the Citadel, which is something I'm sure those of you who love lore will appreciate. There is one more collectible I haven't actually mentioned though that's tied to a game-long side quest with these special jars of sand. Early on in the game you find this broken apart stone mural that details a prophecy of some kind, and you'll need to find all 30 of the sand jars to restore it. Each piece of the mural fixed will get you 50 time crystals, with every 5th jar netting you something like a soma petal or an amulet, so out of every side quest in the game, this one will easily net you the most rewards if you go out of your way to collect a lot of them. In the event you can't get any of what we talked about because you don't have the right abilities yet though, the Lost Crown has a pretty interesting feature that'll help you remember it for later. By holding down on the D-pad, you can use a memory shard to create an in-game screenshot on the map exactly where you took it. If I'm gonna be honest here, this isn't a feature I ever stopped to think Metroidvanias should have, but after seeing it, I kinda feel like this should become a standard thing. Now, I didn't personally utilize it much because frankly I'm too stubborn to use anything except my noodle to remember where things were. However, I think this is probably one of the best quality of life features Metroidvanias should have going forward. Not everyone's stubborn like me, and some people just don't have a great memory altogether. This is a much more reliable and effective way of helping make sure the player remembers what they missed than any map marker could achieve, since it shows you a full screenshot. Now as for the actual abilities themselves though, we have a lot of your usual things like an air dash or a double jump, but the others are a lot more unique than what you might be expecting. See, the thing with all of the new abilities Sargon gets is that they all come from the feathers of the Simurgh, a bird god who holds dominion over time and destiny, so a lot of them are loosely themed after time and space. For starters, we have the Shadow of the Simurgh. By pressing the left bumper, Sargon can leave behind a phantom that you can return to by pressing it again. Honestly, while it may not sound like much, this one is used in some pretty useful and creative ways. Like, you can of course use it for getting back to a certain spot if you fail to jump, but there's tons of puzzles that have you using this to get through doors, and even in completing the Temple of Knowledge's time challenges. Then we have the Dimension Claw, which can store up to one of certain objects or even enemies for later. Said objects are launched when released, and are predominantly used for breaking these yellow glowing walls and floor tiles. For enemies though, they'll actually turn to your side and fight for you in combat once released. And while I rarely use this aspect of Dimension Claw since I never needed it, this is a pretty cool feature that I could definitely see being useful for some. Towards the end of the game, you unlock the Fabric of Time, which lets Sargon grab and pull on these floating spheres to either launch himself or pull down bridges. You can use it on enemies as well to pull yourself to them and vice versa, but I personally never felt the need to use it for that. Finally, we have Clairvoyance. By pressing down on the right stick, you can swap whether these phantom platforms and sometimes even saws are intangible or physical. While it is used for some puzzles, it's predominantly used for platforming challenges, and let me tell ya, putting aside the possibility that I'm just complete trash, these can get pretty difficult. There are plenty of sections that'll really test your skills, and almost all of them were pretty fun and satisfying to get through for me, like a lot of the challenges in the Pit of Eternal Sands. Then by contrast, there's the 2-minute long nightmare of buzzsaws hidden on one of the Haven elevator's lower floors. There isn't really much to say here. The whole thing is a giant test of trial and error where one mistake sends you right back to the beginning. Honestly, I just didn't have the patience for this one. After over an hour of trying, I said to myself, whatever's behind this definitely isn't worth it, and gave up. Kudos to anyone watching this who has beaten it though. For as great as everything I said is though, the Lost Crown's fast travel is like the one weak spot when it comes to getting around and exploring. It's not bad by any means, but there are points where I feel some areas didn't have quite enough spots for fast travel, and this can make backtracking take a bit longer in some areas compared to others. Depending on the person, you might not have an issue with this at all, but if you're anything like me, the moments where fast travel points are a bit too spaced out from each other can be kinda tiring. At the very least though, fighting enemies in between those moments keeps things really fun and satisfying. Combat in the Lost Crown is fast-paced, flashy as heck at points, and fairly unique for a game like this. Sargon will be able to combo enemies by using the twin swords as well as the bow you unlock early on in the game. The bow is about as simple as you'd expect, but the swords have a more in-depth moveset, with their attacks changing based on whether you tilt the analog stick up or down when you press the attack button, and you can even hold it down for a charged attack. It all feels super fluid and it makes combat feel really dynamic. Fighting an enemy with a shield? Work in a charge attack mid-combo to break it. Want to keep the enemy from attacking? Use an up attack to get them into the air if they can be affected by it, and so on and so forth. Just like some other modern Metroidvanias though, you can also parry enemies. This fills up the Athra gauge, which we'll get back to in a moment, and if the attack's yellow when parried, you'll perform a vengeful counter for a ton of damage. If I'm gonna be honest for a moment though, I was kinda bad about actually using this. I'm generally pretty hyper-aggressive when it comes to games like this, so my first instinct is usually to just dodge the attack and get back to beating the crap out of whatever I'm fighting, for better or worse. Now as for the previously mentioned Athra gauge, this is used for special attacks or abilities in combat called Athra surges, of which you can have 2 equipped at a time. By parrying and hitting enemies, you can charge it up to a maximum of 3 bars, with many Athra surges needing 2 or more to use. There are 10 total in the game you can unlock, and while I can't speak for how useful all of them are since I didn't even use half of them, I can say I really like these as a mechanic. These can hit pretty hard of course, but the bigger use for me is how they can be a nice way to stop an enemy from using an unparryable red attack and leave them open for a quick combo or 2. Out of all the ones I used, my favorite one has to be Soul of Gilgamesh. It's a 3-bar Athra Surge that boosts your attack power and speed, and it even boosts your defense against melee attacks, which was pretty useful for some boss fights. On that note though, I gotta say, The Lost Crown can be a fairly hard game when it comes to its bosses, and really just in general. I don't think it's quite as hard as what Metroid Dread can be, but those of you who love a good challenge will really enjoy this game in that regard. Especially since they're also just really good in general, with the second to last boss being my personal favorite. The most memorable boss fight has to go to the giant crab in the depths though, because its hitbox broke on me, and I'm completely serious here, 5 times. Honestly, while I can't say it's good this happened so often, let alone at all, I really wasn't even mad about it. Well, it's probably fixed by the time you're seeing this, there really is just something about finding a random giant sewer crab that spontaneously and consistently becomes immortal that I found kinda funny, weirdly. That being said though, if you're wanting an easier or harder experience, The Lost Crown does let you completely customize the difficulty, right down to specific mechanics for combat like parrying. On a related note, it also gives you the option to play the game in either exploration or guided mode, with the latter adding special icons on the map for your current objective as well as when you don't have the right ability to make progress with, and the former lacking all of that if you don't want the help. While I unfortunately can't speak for how well The Lost Crown compares to previous Prince of Persia games, I can say that I'd love to play another game in the series like this, because this is definitely in my top 10 favorite Metroidvanias. Its story and presentation is definitely really good, but everything about the gameplay, from the platforming to the combat, feels fine-tuned to absolute perfection. I mean, honestly, despite my issues with Ubisoft as a company, and even as a developer at times, The Lost Crown really is a masterpiece of a Metroidvania, and it's a testament to just how talented Ubisoft Montpellier is. Now, hopefully its positive reception means it'll get the sequel it deserves at some point, but regardless, I gotta say, The Lost Crown has me pretty interested in looking into the original series at some point. Aside from the obvious shift in gameplay styles, I'm curious about just how different they are and whether or not I'd like the old series more than this one. But given how much I loved The Lost Crown, that's a pretty high bar. Until then though, thank you all for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and hope you all have a nice day.